We're told we live in a very polarized society. There are all these categories: male, female, black, white, right wing, left wing, democracy, authoritarianism. Each of these categories is quite useful as an idea. It helps us to make decisions and to discuss things. But what happens is they become value judgments, lined up with good and bad, so that whereas right wing and left wing are just attitudes, you could say, left wing becomes an insult, right wing becomes an insult, white becomes an insult, black becomes an insult. Because what was meant to be just a useful category has become a question of good versus bad. And that leads to the idea that, well, if we can get rid of the bad, then everything's going to be good. What a wonderful idea, and people go to war because of that. It doesn't work out that way, because what usually happens is, of course, it's always the good that wins, because it's the victors that write history. So when the good people have won, nearly always they start fragmenting themselves. So you get not just a polarization, but a fragmentation of the world. A good example of that is the Russian Revolution, a very clear situation where you had the aristocrats oppressing the poor people, which was the serfs and the workers. And so surely when you get rid of the aristocrats, the Russian Revolution, what you'll be left with is a workers' paradise. But it didn't work out like that, because immediately after the revolution, you began to have a split between the Trotskyites and the Leninists, who were friends during the revolution. They became enemies. And this is the sort of thing that tends to happen a lot. The trouble with the right-wing parties in Britain has usually been that once they start to build up support and come closer to power, they fragment. The people fall out. So this sort of fragmentation, is it a good thing or a bad thing in itself? Well, it seems to be something to do with life, fundamental to life. For example, taking male and female, when the sperm enters the egg, the ovum, then the ovary splits in two, and then each of those two splits again, and splits again, and splits again. You have a constant fragmentation from the cell's point of view, constantly splitting. But of course, stepping back from that, you can see what's happening is the birth of a new life form. What looks like a fragmentation is actually a building up. A new human is being created. Now, that other side of the coin is when you die, all those cells in you begin splitting up into their component parts, and you rot away. So, what happened in the Russian Revolution? On the one hand, you could say it marked the death of communism, showed it as a sham. On the other hand, you could say this was part of the birth process of a whole new mighty kingdom, the Soviet Empire. So, are we seeing breakdown or are we seeing growth? Do we have an opportunity for learning? But what I wanted to focus on was this way that a category becomes a value judgment, and then it becomes a battle. And I addressed this in a series of talks which I put under the watchlist title of Thoughts on Good and Evil. And in that, I had 3 videos which I call the binary model, the the analog model, and the ternary or trinitarian model. The binary model addressed this question of pure good versus pure evil, which is how people often see it. when they lose their objectivity. And I said that that's a trick. It can't happen because anything pure is sterile. If you take distilled water, nothing will happen. It's sterile. But the moment a bit of dirt falls into that water, then you get the possibilities of life. You get bacteria, you get smells, you get all sorts of horrible things. It comes to life. And life exists on these boundaries between things, like when cold water meets warmer water in the ocean. That's where you get the most life. So this idea of pure good, pure evil is just a trick. And I give the example. If I say that to people, some people say, oh, yes, of course there's pure evil, of course there's pure good. And they might give example like pure evil, Nazism, pure good, Christianity. Well, I've often pointed out that, you see, if Nazism was pure evil, if Hitler had announced this new party, which is pure evil, and we're going to take Germany to war, and we're going to kill off Jews, we're going to have concentration camps and all that sort of thing. Now, human nature being what it is, some people would have voted for that, but he would have never won the majority vote on a bid like that. What he did is he played the MAGA card. He said, quite rightly, that Germany was a great nation that had lost a war and was now being crushed by other people, and it lost its spirit and it was downtrodden. And what we could do is to bring back the greatness and make Germany great again. A very attractive notion, and that's why people voted for it. On the other hand, if you take Christianity, which in its pure theory is very good, in practice you get all these scandals of paedophilia amongst the celibate priests, and you get these massive money-making churches of prosperity theology, which are really exploiting poor people to make a fortune for a few. Because that idea of pure white, pure black just isn't realistic. There's no life there. Whereas, if you take the yin-yang model, where you have the seed of white inside the black and you seed of black inside the white, there you have a living dynamic system. And that is the reality there. So pure black, pure good, pure evil is dead. Whereas if you have a speck of each in the other, you then have a dynamic system. And it's important to know that because you can't defeat the bad unless you know why it has an appeal. In other words, what is the spark of good in it that people are attracted to? Once you know that, you're in a better position to do something about it. So that's the binary model. Now, the analog model is that many things in life are a spectrum. Rather than black and white, you have an infinite number of shades of grey in between. A good example of this is in, I think it's called the Museum of Mankind, near Johannesburg. There's a museum about the history of humanity ever since it was created in South Africa. And at the entrance to that place, there's a long line of skin colour, from the very palest to the very darkest. And what they invite you to do is to hold the inside of your forearm and go along that scale until it matches your colour. And interestingly, there's no black and there's no white on that scale because no one has purely white or purely black skin. All you've got is an infinite range of skin colours in between. And yet the apartheid government try to make that spectrum into a distinction between black and white. It seems so simple, except there were so many complications. First of all, there are many shades, but also you get albino black people, and also sometimes what would seem a very straightforward European family would give birth to a black child because there'd been a lot of racial intermingling in the past. And then you get the people, the Cape Malay, who come from Malaysia, and they didn't fit either category very well, so they were called coloured, and the government tried to sort of sort out this mess they created. So that's example of where something's a spectrum. People try to make a clear distinction in it. A good example also is right wing, left wing. Right wing and left wing are directions, and the same of north and south. There's a thing at present of people talking about the north, meaning the northern hemisphere. And in the northern hemisphere are all the big imperial powers like Russia, China, Europe, Britain, North America. And the idea is that these northern powers conquered and stole the land and exploited the southern countries. That's all very neat and a useful distinction, except you get all the exceptions, like in Britain. There is a north-south divide, but it's almost the other way round. It's the people in the south are ruling over the people in the north. That's how it's perceived, and so on and so forth. Because these are directions, it's not a sharp category. And there's a good example of that. If you have the thought experiment, considering the difference between authoritarian people and the woke people, if you imagine the most woke family you could think of, it's two parents, two children who are probably questioning their own gender. They go on a picnic, or they go on a holiday. They have a picnic in an eco park, and they have their vegan picnic. And then they come home in their Tesla. But on the way back, one of the children has got a tin of Coke. He drinks it and throws it out of the window. His father is so angry that he slams the brakes on the Tesla, orders him to go back, pick up that can, bring it back to the car, and put it in recycling when they get home. Now, at that moment, that very woke father is being utterly authoritarian. It's a question of which way he's looking at that moment. And it doesn't mean he isn't a woke person, but at that moment, anger makes him very authoritarian. And this exists all across the spectrum. You could have someone who is very much a MAGA supporter, and yet sends his children to a free school because he believes that he wants his children to grow up thinking for themselves and being independent. A famous example of that, of course, is Adolf Hitler, who was the absolute epitome of the right wing. But he was a vegetarian, as people love to point out. And what's more woke than that? So, this is another trick. A trick that when we should be seeing a spectrum, what we see is a clear distinction, black and white. So both of these, the binary and the analog model, are tricks. We're being deceived. And that's what I addressed in the third model, which was the trinitarian one, where I said, if the problem is we've got this theology which has God and devil, good and evil, and nothing else, are we bound always to be falling into these battles and crystallizing out into oppositions? What would happen if, as I believe in some old religions from Africa, you had not two gods, but three: a god, a devil, and a trickster. And it's the trickster that is playing these pranks on us. And what I came to the conclusion when I wrote this book, The Good, the Bad, the Funny, exploring that idea, is that once you recognize or introduce the third element into your thinking, what was a polarized battle becomes a flowing situation and you get movement in it. And that the idea of the binary polarity is in most cases a trick. So what I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to look at some of the categories which are themselves quite useful, like objective and subjective. But I'm going to look very closely at the boundaries of these categories and to see in what extent is it actually a trick and where does that take us.